This is part 3 of exploring the significance of Playgirl magazine and Kubrick's The Shining. Recall that in part 2 we had decoded a hidden message in this letter which was related to the Taliesin massacre. We decoded this message using certain words in this Beneath My Yurt letter on page 10 of the Playgirl magazine we see Jack Torrance reading in The Shining. And you can go back and watch part 2 if you haven't already done so, if you don't recall exactly how this message came about or what it means. In this present video, I want to analyze other hidden messages in this letter. Now, I mentioned in part 2 that there are several more messages, and many of them are related to this message here, which was decoded in part 2. However, for reasons that will become clear by the end of this video, I want to focus on a message that is not directly related to the one we decoded in part 2. So this is a bit of a detour from where we left off in part 2, but I think it's important that we take this detour, and I will get back to the message we decoded in part 2 in the next video I put out, which will be part 4. And so with that, let's turn our attention back to the Beneath My Yurt letter. After having gone through the exercise that was done in part 2, I couldn't help but take notice of a series of quotes in the last paragraph of this letter. And I've underlined them in red there, as you can see. And it occurred to me that Kubrick could have embedded another message in this letter in addition to the one that I had just decoded in part 2. As you can see, these three phrases are: "Bring me your fan, Susan, beside my yellow fern, sleeping, and beneath my yurt, 5 smackaroos." So the task at hand now is very similar, or the same sort of thing we did in the previous video, part 2, and that is arrange the letters from these words into a message that Kubrick wants us to see. But before we do that, we have to take note of the fact that there are 2 other phrases within quotation marks, and I've highlighted those phrases in green, as you can see there. And these 2 phrases are "more cats" and "high marine." Now, recall from part 2 that we used these 2 phrases to decode that message previously in part 2. So the question is this: do we also use these 2 phrases for this current message that we're trying to decode? To answer this question, let's compare these 2 phrases to the 3 phrases that we're concentrating on right now. Now, I'll be the first to admit that there's some subjectivity here. There are no cut and dry, black and white, objective rules by which to proceed. But when you look at these 2 phrases, "more cats" and "high marine," and compare them to these other 3 phrases, you can come to some feeling as to how to proceed from here. The first thing I want to point out has to do with "high marine." Both of the words in this phrase are capitalized, whereas when you look at the other phrases, the overwhelming majority of them are in lowercase. And the one exception to that is the name Susan. But anyway, this difference seems to separate this phrase "high marine" from the rest, in my opinion. Another aspect to the phrase "high marine" has to do with the exclamation point, as you can see there. The other phrases don't have anything like this. They don't have an exclamation point or a question mark or anything like that. So this is another aspect to this phrase, "high marine," that seems to separate it from the other phrases in quotation marks. So while it's not possible to be absolutely certain as to Kubrick's intention here, it does seem to be the case that this phrase "Hi Marine" is not meant to be included with the other quoted phrases. Now, in reality, when I was decoding this, what I did was I brought along that phrase "Hi Marine" in case I felt I needed to use letters from that phrase. But as we will see, that was not necessary. Now that we've settled on the words we're going to use, the next task at hand is exactly the same as what we faced in part 2. As you can see here, looking at the right hand side, I've listed the frequency with which each letter of the alphabet appears in this list of words here. So the idea is at this point to rearrange these letters into the phrase or into the message that Kubrick wants us to see in this particular case. So towards that end, it pays, I believe, to analyze these words to see if there's any clues we can find as to how to proceed. And when I looked closely at these words, I found the following possibly helpful clues. Note that the words "me" and "my" appear, with "my" appearing twice. This indicates that this message will have to do with a personal aspect of Stanley Kubrick. That is, something not having to do with the Taliesin massacre, but rather something that concerns Stanley Kubrick personally. Next, note the words "Fan" and "Susan." When you look at these words spelled backwards, you have NAS and then NA, which in my mind evokes the acronym NASA, which is interesting because there are a lot of people, including me, who believe that Stanley Kubrick was involved with the NASA's fake Apollo moon program. The phrase "yellow fern" suggests images of fire or flame, and the word "sleeping" appearing right after this phrase would therefore suggest something like death by fire. Also, I believe that the appearance of the word 5 is significant. Keep in mind that on the Rothschild family crest you will find 5 downward pointing arrows, so this is a possible reference to that image. And lastly, take note of the word "smackaroos." This is a slang term for money, and this is a possible reference again to the Rothschilds, who, if you will recall, are extremely wealthy. So we have our words, we have our clues. The next step is to just grind away and try and come up with the best possible solution. As I mentioned in part 2, there's no shortcut to this. But anyway, after going through that process, I arrived at the following message. The first thing I want to point out here are the numbers in red and blue. As you can see, the numbers in red match the numbers in blue. So this is a pretty good indication to me anyway that this message is pretty close to what Stanley Kubrick is trying to say here. And so now what I want to do at this point is explain the various facets of this message and just illustrate, in my opinion, what is being said here and how it relates to The Shining and to Stanley Kubrick. The first thing I want to cover has to do with 5 arrows. As I mentioned before, this is a reference to the Rothschilds. I think that's pretty self-evident here. What's really interesting or intriguing here is the fact that he's saying that he and his family has seen death by 5 arrows. This suggests or implies that he and his family were subjected to intimidation or coercion of some kind. It's not really clear exactly what he's getting at this point. I will say, however, that as I've mentioned before, there are other messages, and I believe that a careful consideration of these messages will shed light on this situation. And I'll get to this in a later video. And in passing, I think it's worth noting something here, and that is this explains why Kubrick had to be so circumspect in the way he's going about revealing these messages. It really drives home the fact that he had to be very careful about how he goes about telling us these things. The Rothschilds are extremely wealthy and powerful, and with this message he's telling us they're also very ruthless. So again, this explains why we have to jump through so many hoops to get to what Kubrick wants us to see. Moving on, the next aspect to this message I want to get to has to do with Stanley Kubrick referring to NASA as moon ruse creeps. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of people who suspect that the Apollo moon landings were hoaxed and that Kubrick was part of it. With this simple phrase here, Kubrick is confirming those suspicions as far as I am concerned. And just in passing, if you actually still believe in the Apollo moon landings, then there's a really good PDF file out there on the internet called Wagging the Moon Doggy by David McGowan. It's very well done. He succinctly and very effectively just completely demolishes the whole moon landing narrative, and I suggest you look into that if you actually still believe that Neil Armstrong or anybody else actually walked on the moon. Now, getting back to the message, the fact that Stanley Kubrick is referring to NASA as creeps implies, I think pretty obviously actually, that he did not have a good relationship with NASA. And furthermore, when you consider this phrase, moon ruse creeps, along with the fact that he's saying he had seen death by the Rothschilds, it all is very suggestive of Kubrick being coerced or forced somehow against his will to taking part in this in the Apollo moon landing hoax. So we're going to return to this actually in a later message. I'll get to this in a future video. The next aspect here I want to get to is the phrase Gus G, etc. In my opinion, Kubrick is referring here to the crew of the Apollo 1 mission, which consisted of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. As many people know, on January 27th, 1967, there was a fire during a routine training exercise in the command module, with the result being that all 3 men were killed. And of course, NASA called it an accident. But an important thing to keep in mind here is that the crew, these 3 men here, were clearly very unhappy with the state of affairs within the Apollo program. This isn't a matter of opinion. As you can see in those 2 pictures there, these 3 astronauts were going public with their displeasure. On the left picture, you can see they're sort of mock praying for I guess what you would call was super or divine intervention for the program. And on the right-hand picture there, you can see a lemon hanging on the door of the command module. And apparently, from what I could gather, that was put there by Gus Grissom. There was a lemon tree in his backyard. He took one of the lemons off of it, and he literally hung a lemon on the command module. Now, whether or not these men were thinking about or on the cusp of going public with the fraudulent Apollo program is unknown. However, in the context of this message here and this analysis we're doing, clearly Kubrick is telling us that the fire was no accident. Kubrick is telling us that NASA murdered these men. And furthermore, the interesting aspect to this is that when you look at The Shining with the Apollo 1 mission in mind, you can find references to this event. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a few minutes showing what I'm talking about here. The following observations came from a website I stumbled across that goes heavy into The Shining analysis. It's, as you can see there, it's www.allis.com. I do want to say that they really emphasize the Apollo aspect here, I think overly so. So I don't agree with everything they say, but they did have some interesting observations concerning Apollo 1 references, and I want to just basically summarize these references. Just before Danny goes into room 237, we see him in the hallway right outside of that room. And as you can see there, there are these red hexagonal shapes there. And it is apparently the case that these pads, or these shapes here, are similar to the hexagonal launching pad that the Apollo missions were launched from. And furthermore, the fact that they are colored red is a reference to the Apollo 1 fire. Now, take note of the toy trucks that Danny is playing with. You can see there, right in front of his left hand, there appears to be a toy cement mixer truck. But when you look very closely at this toy, it looks like this is a truck that's carrying what looks to be a lemon. And this, I believe, is referencing the fact that Gus Grissom, as I pointed out earlier, actually hung a lemon on the command module. Now, take note of the sweater that Danny Torrance is wearing. When he stands up, when you look at the just underneath Apollo, it appears to be the number 11. However, when you look closely at that number, it really resembles more the Roman numeral 2, as in Apollo 2. So the sweater isn't referring to Apollo 11, it's really referring to Apollo 2. And this is significant because the next time we see Danny, or rather the first time we see him after he comes out of room 237, as you can see, his sweater has been torn. And I believe this is referencing the fact that Apollo 2 was canceled. It was scrubbed due to the Apollo 1 fire. So that concludes the analytical aspect to this video. What I want to do now is return to something that I referred to at the very beginning of this video. Recall that at the beginning of this video I mentioned that I wanted to deviate from the messages in this Beneath My Yurt letter, which had to do with the Taliesin massacre. And the reason I wanted to do that is I wanted to really drive home or demonstrate for you an important aspect to this Beneath My Yurt letter, and that has to do with the phrase, more cats. Recall that we've used this phrase, more cats, to decode the message in part 2, and we used that phrase to decode this message in this video. Just as a reminder, what you have here is on the left are the words that or phrases that were used to decode the message in part 2, and on the right are the words and phrases that were used to decode the message in this video. And as you can see, in both cases we ended up using the phrase more cats. Now, there are 3 more messages from this letter I want to show you in forthcoming videos, and they all build upon or are related to the message from part 2 that had to do with the Taliesin massacre. And the way Kubrick set up his code here, or this letter, is that this phrase, more cats, is used in every single message that we decode. And I wanted to go to this particular message here in part 3 to really demonstrate for you this aspect, so that when I use this phrase, more cats, in future videos, you'll understand what's going on. That this phrase, more cats, is sort of a universal skeleton key, or it's a piece of the puzzle that fits in every separate puzzle that Kubrick has set up here for us. So that's the end of this video, part 3. Coming up in part 4, we're going to get back to the Taliesin massacre where we left off in part 2. So that should be coming up pretty soon. So stay tuned and I'll see you then.